Marcus had always known his sister was ruthless, but he never imagined she'd destroy his life for money. The realization hit him like a freight train as he sat in the cramped interrogation room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while Detective Hayes slid a manila folder across the metal table. "We found these in your apartment, Mr. Whitmore," the detective said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty that made Marcus's stomach drop. Inside the folder were photographs of documents he'd never seen before, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, receipts for items he'd never purchased, and most damning of all, what appeared to be his own signature on papers authorizing the theft of nearly $2 million from his late father's estate. "This isn't possible," Marcus whispered, his hands trembling as he flipped through the evidence. "I've never seen any of this before. Someone planted these." Detective Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with the practiced eye of someone who'd heard every excuse in the book. "That's what they all say, son. But the evidence doesn't lie. Your fingerprints are on half these documents, and your sister Victoria provided us with some very interesting information about your gambling debts." The mention of Victoria's name sent a chill down Marcus's spine. His sister had been the one to comfort him after their father's funeral 6 months ago, the one who'd helped him sort through their father's papers and navigate the complex web of his business empire. She'd been so supportive, so understanding about his grief. How could she be behind this? "What did Victoria tell you?" Marcus asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "She came to us 3 days ago, very reluctantly, I might add. Said she'd discovered some irregularities in the estate accounts and was worried about you. Mentioned that you'd been acting strangely since your father's death, drinking more, staying out late. She showed us text messages where you'd asked her for money. Said you owed some dangerous people." Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. Those text messages were real. He had asked Victoria for help with some debts, but they were legitimate business loans he'd taken to expand his photography studio, not gambling debts to dangerous criminals. How had she twisted everything so perfectly? "She also mentioned that you'd been asking a lot of questions about the will," Detective Hayes continued. "Seemed upset that your father left the majority of his assets to charity, with only modest inheritances for you and your sister. She was concerned you might do something desperate." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Victoria had been there for every conversation about their father's will. She'd seen his disappointment when the lawyer read the terms. Their father had indeed left most of his wealth to various charities, giving each of his children only enough to live comfortably, not lavishly. Victoria had seemed equally disappointed, but she'd hidden it well behind a mask of acceptance and family solidarity. "I want a lawyer," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Detective Hayes nodded and stood up. "That's your right. But Marcus, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Your sister provided us with security footage from your father's office building, showing you there on the night the transfers were made. Your keycard was used to access the building after hours." As the detective left the room, Marcus buried his face in his hands. The security footage would be real. He had gone to his father's office that night. Victoria had called him, crying, saying she'd found some of their father's personal items there and couldn't bear to go alone. He'd met her there, helped her pack up a box of photographs and mementos. She'd even thanked him, hugging him tightly as they left together. Now he realized it had all been an elaborate setup. She'd needed him there, needed his keycard access, needed his fingerprints on things. While he'd been grieving and trying to be a supportive brother, Victoria had been orchestrating his downfall with surgical precision. The door opened again, and a public defender entered, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with kind eyes, but an overwhelmed demeanor. As she introduced herself and began explaining his situation, Marcus's mind raced. If Victoria had framed him this thoroughly, if she was willing to send her own brother to prison, then the money was just the beginning. There had to be something else, something bigger at stake. He thought about their father's business empire, the complex web of investments and properties that the charity organizations would now inherit. Victoria had always been the smart one, the one who understood finance and legal structures. If she could eliminate him from the equation and somehow gain control of those charitable foundations. Marcus looked up at his lawyer with new determination burning in his eyes. "I need you to listen very carefully," he said. "My sister didn't just frame me for theft. She's planning something much bigger, and we need to figure out what it is before it's too late." Before his lawyer could respond, the door burst open and Detective Hayes returned, his expression grim. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm afraid there's been a development. Your sister Victoria was found dead in her apartment an hour ago." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Despite everything she'd done to him, Victoria was still his sister, the girl who used to build blanket forts with him when they were children. "What happened?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse with shock. "Apparent suicide," Detective Hayes said, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. "She left a note confessing to framing you. Said the guilt was eating her alive and she couldn't live with what she'd done." Marcus's lawyer, Sarah Chen, immediately leaned forward. "Detective, this changes everything. If Victoria confessed—" "It does change things," Hayes interrupted. "But not the way you might think. The confession note was typed, not handwritten. And here's the interesting part. It was sent to 3 different news outlets simultaneously, 20 minutes before we estimate her time of death. Someone wanted to make sure this story got out." A cold dread settled in Marcus's stomach. "You don't think she killed herself?" "I think your sister was cleaning up loose ends," Detective Hayes said grimly. "But she wasn't working alone, and whoever her partner was decided she'd become a liability." Sarah Chen was already taking notes. "Detective, with this confession, surely you can't continue to hold my client." "Actually, we can. The confession raises more questions than it answers. Victoria claims she acted alone, but the financial crimes we're investigating required access to systems and accounts that she didn't have. Someone with significant banking connections helped orchestrate this theft, and that someone is still out there." Marcus felt his brief surge of hope crumble. "So even with her confession, I'm still the primary suspect." "You're still a person of interest. But we're also looking at this from a new angle now." Detective Hayes pulled out another folder. "Your sister's apartment was thoroughly searched. We found something interesting hidden in her bedroom. Documents showing she'd been in contact with someone at Meridian Trust, the bank that managed your father's estate accounts." The name sent a jolt of recognition through Marcus. Meridian Trust. That's where Dad's business partner James Crawford works. He's been a family friend for 20 years. Detective Hayes nodded. "James Crawford, Senior Vice President. We're bringing him in for questioning this afternoon. Seems he and your sister had been exchanging quite a few private messages over the past year, well before your father's death." Marcus's mind raced as the implications became clear. James Crawford had been at every family gathering, every business meeting. He knew the family dynamics, understood exactly how much Victoria resented their father's decision to leave most of his wealth to charity. More importantly, he had the banking access and expertise to pull off the kind of sophisticated theft they were investigating. "There's something else," Detective Hayes continued. "The charitable organizations that inherited your father's estate? 3 of them have reported suspicious activity in their accounts over the past month. Someone's been attempting to gain administrative access to their funds." "Let me guess," Marcus said, pieces clicking into place. "Those attempts started right after my arrest became public." "Exactly. Someone was counting on you being convicted and out of the picture permanently. With you in prison, and Victoria apparently racked with guilt over framing you, it would be much easier to manipulate the charitable foundations and redirect those funds." Sarah Chen looked up from her notes. "Detective, this suggests a much larger conspiracy. My client was clearly set up to be the fall guy while the real perpetrators gained access to the entire estate. That's our working theory now. But here's the problem. Victoria's death might have been intended to tie up loose ends, but it's also eliminated our best source of information about how this scheme really worked." Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of what his sister had been involved in. "James Crawford was like an uncle to us growing up. He taught me how to fish, came to my college graduation. Why would he do this?" "Money makes people do terrible things," Detective Hayes said simply. "Your father's estate was worth over $50 million. Even a fraction of that would be worth killing for, apparently." The detective stood up to leave, but paused at the door. "Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask, did your sister ever mention feeling threatened by anyone? Any indication she might have been scared?" Marcus thought back to their last conversation, just days before his arrest. Victoria had seemed nervous, kept checking her phone and looking over her shoulder when they met for coffee. At the time, he'd attributed it to stress over their father's death and the complex estate proceedings. "She was acting strange the last few weeks," Marcus admitted. "Paranoid almost. But I thought it was grief." Detective Hayes nodded grimly. "We think she realized her partner was planning to eliminate her once you were convicted. The confession letter was probably her attempt to protect herself, but it backfired." As the detective left the room, Marcus sat in stunned silence, processing everything he'd learned. His sister was dead. He was still facing serious criminal charges, and somewhere out there, James Crawford was probably celebrating what he thought was a perfectly executed plan. 2 days later, Marcus was released on bail thanks to Victoria's confession letter, despite the ongoing investigation. Sarah Chen had argued successfully that the new evidence created reasonable doubt about his guilt, and the judge agreed to let him await trial from home rather than jail. But freedom felt hollow when he knew the real mastermind was still out there. Marcus drove straight to his father's old office building, the same place where Victoria had lured him to plant evidence. The security guard, an elderly man named Frank, who'd known Marcus since he was a teenager, greeted him with sympathetic eyes. "Sorry about your sister, son," Frank said quietly. "And all this business with the police. Your father would be rolling in his grave if he knew what was happening to his family." "Frank, I need to ask you something," Marcus said, an idea forming in his mind. "The night Victoria and I came here to collect Dad's things, do you remember anything unusual about that evening?" Frank scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something odd. Your sister arrived about an hour before you did. Said she was waiting for you, but she went up to your father's office alone first. Stayed up there quite a while before you showed up." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Did anyone else come to the building that night?" "Funny you should ask. James Crawford was here earlier that day around closing time. Said he needed to retrieve some documents from your father's office. I thought it was strange since the estate lawyers had already been through everything, but he had authorization paperwork." The pieces were falling into place. James had planted the forged documents earlier in the day. Then Victoria had gone up alone to make sure everything was positioned correctly before Marcus arrived. They'd orchestrated every detail to ensure his fingerprints would be on the evidence. "Frank, do you still have the security footage from that day? Should be on the system for another few weeks before it gets wiped." "Why?" "I think it might show something the police missed." 20 minutes later, Marcus was staring at a computer screen in the security office, watching grainy footage of that fateful night. There was James Crawford entering the building at 5:47 p.m., carrying a briefcase. There was Victoria arriving at 8:15 p.m., looking nervous and checking her phone constantly. And there was Marcus himself at 9:23 p.m., looking tired and grief-stricken as he met his sister in the lobby. But it was what happened after that caught Marcus's attention. At 10:45 p.m., as he and Victoria were leaving the building together, the camera caught something he'd missed that night. A figure in the parking garage, partially obscured by shadows, watching them leave. The timestamp showed the person remained there for another 15 minutes after their departure. "Frank, can you enhance this image?" The security guard squinted at the screen and adjusted some settings. The figure became clearer. It was definitely James Crawford, confirming he'd stayed to make sure the setup had gone according to plan. Marcus felt a surge of determination. The police might have enough to question James, but they needed concrete proof of his involvement in both the fraud and Victoria's death. And Marcus realized he might be the only one who could get it. He spent the next 2 days researching James Crawford's movements and habits. The man was methodical, paranoid even, but he was also arrogant. He'd executed what he thought was the perfect crime, and people like that often couldn't resist the urge to gloat or tie up loose ends personally. On Thursday evening, Marcus positioned himself across the street from Meridian Trust Bank, watching as James left work. Instead of going home to his suburban house, James drove to a small storage facility on the outskirts of town. Marcus followed at a distance, his heart pounding, as he realized he might be about to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. James used a key to access Unit 247, and through the partially open door, Marcus could see him moving boxes and papers around. After 20 minutes, James emerged carrying a small metal box and drove away. Marcus waited until the facility was quiet, then approached the storage unit. The lock was standard, and his years of photography work had taught him how to pick simple locks for abandoned building chutes. Inside the unit, he found boxes of documents, financial records, correspondence, and most damning of all, detailed plans outlining exactly how the estate fraud was supposed to work. There were notes in James's handwriting describing how to manipulate the charitable foundations, forged documents with various signatures, and most chilling of all, a typed note that read, "V becoming liability. Confession letter plan acceptable. Will handle cleanup personally." Marcus photographed everything with his phone, his hands shaking as he realized he was looking at evidence of premeditated murder. James hadn't just killed Victoria, he'd planned it as part of the overall scheme. As he prepared to leave, Marcus heard footsteps approaching the storage unit. He quickly pocketed his phone and looked for another way out, but there wasn't one. The footsteps stopped right outside the unit, and Marcus heard the familiar voice of James Crawford speaking quietly on a phone. "Everything's cleaned up now. The brother's out on bail, but that won't matter once the additional evidence surfaces. By next week, he'll be back in custody, and this time there won't be any bail." Marcus realized with growing horror that James wasn't done framing him. There was more evidence being planted, more manipulation happening even now. He pressed himself against the back wall of the storage unit, barely breathing as James continued his conversation just feet away.
Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more interesting content coming soon.